So if you would like to start, Shoshana, I think we're ready.
Thank you, Avital. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have this wonderful partnership of JFSA, Shalom Task Force, and Naaleh Cleveland. The reason that I am so passionate about this program is that last December, I was asked to join the JFSA board. And one of the committees that I sit on within the JFSA community is the Strengthening Families Committee. And over the past year, through the various board meetings that we've had, the stories that were shared with us are stories that are both so painful to hear and so heartwarming to see how JFSA has come to the aid of the people counting on us. We have been there to support these women. We've been there to empower these women. We have listened to their stories. We have held their hands. And most importantly, together as a community, we have helped them through it all. We recognize that the future strength of our very small and very connected community lies in the values that we model and nurture for our children. And I am so happy that we are all together tonight to discuss this topic. I would like to introduce you to our wonderful panelists this evening. First of all, we have Rebbetzin Dina Davidovich. As many of you know, Dina is not only a wonderful Rebbetzin, but also director of the Cleveland Community Mikvah. Dina is a first responder for so many women, sometimes through the challenging moments of their relationships. We are fortunate to have a leader who is a true partner in promoting safety, support, and most importantly, with sensitivity. Dina has cultivated relationships with JFSA and Shalom Task Force to promote opportunities for women to receive professional support, as well as the wraparound support of community leadership and resources. Thank you, Dina, for always being there for the community and joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Avital Levin. Avital is a social worker and educator who writes and frequently presents on issues related to healthy dating, relationships, domestic abuse, and sexual assault. She is the director of education at Shalom Task Force. Thank you, Avital, for being with us this evening also. Yael Farkas. Yael is a licensed professional mental health counselor and advocate at JFSA. Yael is an experienced educator, has worked with children in a school setting as well as adults in a clinical setting. She has provided mental health counseling for a variety of clients and advocacy, as well as therapy for survivors of domestic abuse. Thank you, Yael, for being here for us this evening. One feature that I wanted to just mention, that all participants can please submit any questions anonymously through the question and answer feature. Everything will be kept anonymous, and our wonderful panelists would love to address any questions you might have. Additionally, you can find in the chat box all the information that you need to reach out to Jewish Family Services. Dina?
Hey, thank you. Yael asked me to join this program. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the experience that I've had working in the community and working with JFSA and Shalom Task Force a little bit. They're always trying to make sure that these organizations are very accessible to the women in our community and encouraging that collaboration. I think that we also sometimes find that people, hesitate when there's something so personal and they need assistance, and they're not always sure. And knowing that we have people that can help them and help them weather the storm is really, really very comforting. That partnership also extends because sometimes we've also had situations where JFSA has worked with people where they needed a little bit more background from what I do, and they've reached out to me and we've sort of collaborated to work with people together. We also sometimes, I just remember one situation in particular I'll share with you. There's many, many times where we've turned to JFSA for help, but I think like Shoshana said, I'm often a first responder. Sometimes people come to me with situations and I'm not a therapist. So if they do that, then I can help them through. But sometimes part of my job is knowing when to pass them along to someone who's a little more experienced. And once I remember a young woman came to me, she was married a few years, and she was quite concerned about the state of her marriage. I had taught her as a kala, and she just was a wreck. And when she was telling me what was happening, I was thinking like, oh no, this is not going in a good place. And I knew it needed more help. And JFSA was right there. They sent me a book that was a perfect resource for her, set her up with a great therapist. And I think, not every story ends amazingly, but that one I remember just when she came to me thinking like, this is just not going to a good place. And JFSA stepped in, and thank God she is happily married, and she and her husband are doing so well. And I don't want to give too many identifying details, but it was just amazing to me to see that someone could really work through a problem and not be in it. And sometimes that's for the best too, but certainly those are situations where they can really help people figure out how to maneuver the situations and give them the support that they need.
Thank you, Dina. And thank you, Shoshana, Yael. It's really a pleasure for me to join you this evening. Dina, I want to also point out how integral and how vital the presence of a supportive mikvah is in a community. This past Sunday, I was privileged to offer training for 60 mikvah attendants. And some of the stories and the cases and the questions that these mikvah attendants shared really demonstrated for me and for us at Shalom Task Force how very much you are first responders to women in the community. And we so appreciate your partnership with us in this work. Shoshana and Yael, it's my pleasure together with Shalom Task Force, to be able to really collaborate on this program and to be able to enjoy such a strong partnership with the JFSA here in Cleveland. As Shoshana mentioned, I'm the Director of Education for Shalom Task Force. Our office is based in Manhattan, but we're an international nonprofit, and we have the opportunity to cultivate relationships and partnerships with several communities across the US. We also have a strong base in Israel, and the stronger our partnerships are with local communities, the more able we are to really support callers to our hotline and to be able to offer them local resources. So anybody who calls from the Cleveland community to our hotline is able to really be offered amazing resources here locally in Cleveland. And we're very grateful for this partnership. So in the education department, together with a team of dedicated presenters, we teach individuals about forming and sustaining healthy relationships. Last year, our educational programs reached over 7,000 individuals across the US and internationally. Even if only one person's life was altered by our Shalom Task Force workshops, we know that we are one step closer to living our mission of safe relationships, healthy families, and a supportive community. The Shalom Task Force organization offers, as I mentioned, the hotline. We recently launched a chat line as well. So when somebody reaches out to our confidential anonymous hotline, they are able to either call in or now to chat in through text, WhatsApp, and this provides another opportunity. We were able to launch this now during COVID, recognizing the importance of safety and opportunity for somebody to reach out for help to our hotline without even needing to speak out loud. The Shalom Task Force hotline number, we're going to put it in the chat, 888-883-2323. And it's the same number for calls, chat, confidential, anonymous. We also have a legal department that is comprised of a team of attorneys who represent victims of domestic abuse pro bono. And somebody who reaches out to our legal department is either able to be fully represented if they're based in New York, but we do also get calls from victims in other areas, and our legal team is able to provide very culturally specific legal support. recognizing how to navigate based-in and services that are really important for Orthodox victims of abuse. I mentioned our affiliation with JFSA, and I'm happy to pass it over to you, Yael.
Hi, my name is Yael Farkas, and as Shoshana introduced, I'm a mental health counselor and a comprehensive community advocate at JFSA in the domestic violence department. I also want to acknowledge our gratitude to Naaleh Cleveland for partnering with us in this webinar. We've had a wonderful relationship with them in helping to serve our clients together, and it means a lot to us that you supported us in this. JFSA, among many other things, helps clients navigate the maze of social service, legal, medical, and vocational systems that individuals who are survivors of domestic violence need to work through to achieve self-sufficiency. For people who call in, we provide them case management, and that's for those who are concerned for themselves and or for friends and family members. We provide safety assessment and planning, legal advocacy, connection and referrals to government and community resources, support, education, referral to mental health services, trauma-specific therapy, a journey to empowerment support group, which is now taking place over Zoom, among many other things. Additionally, we also offer a Hebrew shelter home, which provides emergency and temporary housing for Jewish women and children escaping domestic violence or facing homelessness. It's a beautiful 5-bedroom Jewish home located in a residential community. It's Shomer Shabbos and provides kosher food, as well as case management and support to help families provide them independent housing and self-sufficiency. I'm also going to paste the information for JFSA in the chat box. We are local out in Pepper Pike on Chagrin, and feel free to contact us for those services or many others, and specifically May Bennett for any domestic violence services. And I'm going to post all that information right now in the chat. Avital?
So why are parents such important partners for promoting healthy relationships? Last year, I received a call from a mother after a program that I held in Muncie to support individuals who were dating, as well as mothers who were wishing to support their children through this process. She reached out to me and she shared that she had noticed a lot of concerning dynamics in her daughter's marriage, and she was seeking help. She observed that her daughter seemed very quiet and shut down, which was not typical for her. She seemed very nervous around her husband. And she started to share some feelings with her mother a few times, but stopped herself and insisted that everything was fine. The mother wasn't sure if this was just typical newlywed adjustment or if there might be something more concerning going on. And she was thinking about how to best be supportive for her child while also respecting her boundaries and marriage. She asked all the right questions, and her ability to be thoughtful and balanced, navigating her own sense of protection and protectiveness as a mother, was very inspiring. She did everything right. Your role as a parent often offers the greatest opportunity for encouraging healthy relationships. Often a parent's response can impact the situation. Knowing how to express concern without being seen as a threat or another controlling force. And as a community, we all seek to become a supportive force. We often receive calls on the hotline from concerned family members, friends. We offer skills and best practices for some of these observers or individuals in the person's life who are looking to support the person. And many times people call us with questions, similar to this mother who reached out to me. It isn't always clear what might be going on, and it isn't always clear, especially in dating. And we encourage people to reach out with questions.
When we talk about the influence that you can have as a parent, that obviously starts well before the dating and marriage stage. And we're going to focus on some opportunities there are in childhood when really we can have our greatest influence. So every parent who's ever had a toddler reaches this great milestone, we hope, where one can sit on the bench and watch their kid play in the sandbox and maybe get 2 minutes of free time. And when you bring your child to that sandbox, Sometimes they'll bring their favorite toy. So imagine that your son, who's 2.5 years old, is so excited to play with his favorite truck in the sandbox. And of course, the big bully, who's a whole year older than him, comes and slaps him down and takes his truck away. Generally, we don't tell that child, oh, let's be kind to that 3-year-old boy and let him take your truck away. We model instead that our child deserves his own dignity and respect. Go over to that 3-year-old boy, get the truck back, and possibly involve that 3-year-old's mother if that's necessary. We need to show our child that his safety and his dignity are most important to us. We as parents have a responsibility to not only teach our children to treat others with dignity and safety, but that they deserve the same treatment themselves. How else do we teach children to expect dignity and safety in their relationships? We do it through our relationships with our children. Our children should know that no matter what they do, we'll treat them with respect for who they are and their choices. For example, we might not be thrilled when our daughter brings home a grade on her math test that's not quite what we expected. But obviously, we don't resort to insulting or degrading her or making her feel disrespected. Our daughters will learn that likewise, they deserve the same baseline respectful treatment from others, and certainly from a future spouse. One would expect that in a presentation about healthy relationships, we'd focus primarily on how to treat others, which is obviously the key in relationships. But possibly our most important role as parents is to first teach our children to respect themselves. Children who are instilled with a healthy internal sense of self-esteem and self-respect are more likely to grow up to be adults who will recognize their need for respect in relationships and more likely to treat others with that same respect. Also, children who know that their parents respect them and their need for dignity and safety are going to be the adults in the future who they're more likely to turn to and be open with for support and assistance if there are issues in their dating and marital relationships.
So what needs to be in place in a healthy relationship? Anytime we teach about relationships, we recognize that there's a relationship spectrum, healthy, unhealthy, and abusive. And since relationships are so dynamic, it can be confusing to clearly identify or to be able to categorize where this relationship falls on the spectrum. What is really important for us to recognize, and is the focus of tonight's presentation, is the very specific definition of a domestic abuse relationship and the very specific elements of a healthy relationship. This will allow us to support someone correctly when in an abusive situation, and most importantly, shape how we set our goals for ourselves and our children to be in healthy relationships. So what does a healthy relationship look like? A student once asked me at a workshop, but how do you know what a healthy relationship is? And it gave me pause because I think that sometimes we take for granted, we assume that people will just know how to be in a healthy relationship, know what that looks like, know what that feels like. And the truth is, this question highlights the need for awareness around clearly identifying healthy markers of a relationship, not making assumptions about what people know or don't know. One of the exercises that we do with students when we give school workshops is we ask them to describe some of the positive traits that they would be excited to share with a friend who they were setting up. Okay, so a friend of theirs is dating and they're going to set this friend up. And what are some of the positive traits that they would be really excited to share about the person who they're setting their friend up with? And they list several traits that they might describe to their friend. Maybe someone outgoing, someone intelligent, maybe someone tall. Then we hone in on those traits to identify which of those are subjective to that unique specific person. And of course, that will determine personal unique compatibility. But those subjective needs cannot be ignored, of course. But then we come up with our list of the non-negotiable universal traits and dynamics that every single person needs to have in place in a healthy relationship. And what are those universal markers of a healthy relationship? So of course, the overarching one, the one that needs to be in place in any healthy relationship and is really the antidote to the power control dynamic of an abusive relationship is respect, overarching respect in the relationship. And respect is, it's at the core of how people communicate in the relationship, how they might resolve conflict, the general tone and demeanor of a partner's presence in the relationship. That needs to be in place through overall overarching throughout the relationship. Other important healthy markers and dynamics that need to be in place also include having a voice and an opinion. And sometimes people get confused by this piece. This doesn't mean that somebody needs to be loud or have an opinion about everything. It doesn't mean that both people have to have exactly a 50% breakdown of having their opinion heard. But it does mean that when you have an opinion about something, when something is really important to you, it is heard and respected by your spouse. It is not minimized. It is not silenced. Another important healthy marker of a relationship is taking space. In every healthy relationship, there is an opportunity for taking space. This might mean taking physical space when a situation is tense, or simply having some time and space for yourself or to reflect on the relationship. And this is incredibly important. We see this to be very vital, especially in the dating stage, when we see more frequently now, even because of how much people are just bombarded with technology usage. It's incredibly important when dating for somebody to be able to come home from a date and to take some time and space to process how they are feeling and to reflect on what was coming up on the date for them and how they were feeling about it. It really is critical for making grounded decisions and to kind of take the temperature of the relationship and the health of the relationship. Another important element, of course, is trust and honesty. This is very defining for a healthy relationship, and generally feeling safe. And this means when a person feels just generally at ease, it's really the opposite of the walking on eggshells dynamic that is very much a part of an abusive relationship. So we teach our children and ourselves about these healthy markers at any stage, about any relationship, and we reinforce these messages during the dating stage. Being sure to ask our children these questions to identify what is really happening on dates and how they're feeling. Last week, we invited Rebbitzin Ruffel Goldsbaum to speak with our group of Shell and Task Force educators and advocates. And she emphasized the trap that often occurs now with dating. And I think, Dina, maybe Shoshana also, I think you know Ruffel. I was speaking with her about this program here. And she really emphasized that what she's seeing a lot, and she's kind of like a mentor's mentor, a teacher's teacher. She trains many college teachers. She's really in the field in terms of what's coming up for relationships and dating. And she emphasized that what she sees happening a lot now, one of the traps with dating is where people become so hung up on checklists, on the logical aspects, that they really forget to check in with how they're feeling. So somebody is suggested a shidduch, they have their checklist. Does the person add up? Check, check, check. Okay, let's go out. A few dates. Checklist. It's going well. He said this. She said this. They went there. They went to that hotel lobby. They did that. Check, check, check. It's good. It's all good on paper. Move it forward. And she pointed out that when we forget the extremely important element of making sure to consider what's going on in the emotional space for the person, how the person is actually feeling, looking beyond the checklist, we're missing a really critical element to being able to identify if this relationship is a healthy one. So as a community, we also at times focus on image, attending the right schools, having the perfect shidduch resumes. A lot of people feel a lot of pressure and a lot of focus on pictures, being pressured to send pictures around along with their shidduch resume. And as parents, it's really important to be aware if you are starting to lower your standards for your child because perhaps a shidduch hasn't been suggested for a few months and you're starting to panic. And that's very real. Parents do feel, unfortunately, I speak to so many parents who feel so panicked when their children are dating. And if you notice that maybe you're starting to gloss over some of the concerns or potentially even red flags, we need to really be aware of that. We need to be honest about that. We need to look out for that. We need to be careful of becoming vulnerable to glossing over some of these concerns and red flags. And when supporting your child through the dating process, we want to make sure to ask them the right questions and the important questions. So we have this conversation with your children about recognizing red flags of abuse and healthy dating in Cleveland. Shalom Task Force, for the past couple of years, we're currently providing education awareness workshops at Yavne, at Mostos, now starting at Chaviva and Fuchs Mizrahi. And we encourage you, we invite you to please continue these conversations with your children. So I prepared a screening tool that serves as almost a way to ask some of these questions, to take the temperature of the relationship. It's called the Shalom Task Force Relationship Screening. It's on the Shalom Task Force website under the resources tab. And that under resources, there's a lot of other education awareness that's available there for anybody who's interested in looking at that. Yeah.
Thanks, Avital. We think it's important at this point when we're talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships that we point out the difference between a relationship that has unhealthy characteristics, even red flags, but that can often change for the better with some hard work, accountability, sometimes involving assistance from Rabbanim, Rebbitzins, as well as mental health practitioners. And the difference between that and a relationship involving abuse, or what we call domestic violence. Domestic violence is a repeated pattern of behavior that one partner uses to gain power and control over their partner through various forms of abuse. Some of those forms include physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, religious, technological, and or financial abuse. It's ongoing and usually escalates and manifests as a distinct imbalance in the relationship when one partner is in some way afraid of the other.
Now, can I just ask a question over here? Some people are wondering, I think, when it comes to talking about domestic violence, I think there's a perception out there sometimes that doesn't affect the frum world as much as it affects the rest of the world. What would you say how would you evaluate that statement? Like, does the frum community see as much of this as there is in the general world?
Ina, thanks so much for bringing up that question. And actually, before I started working at JFSA a few years ago, I was convinced that we figured it out and that it was definitely not the same rate in the frum community as it was in the rest of the world. We know statistically, domestic violence affects at least 1 in 4 women at some point in their life. As much as we wish we could inoculate our community, domestic violence appears at a similar rate in the Orthodox community to the rest of society and affects every kind of household in Cleveland and in the rest of the world, regardless of age, income, education, religion, or chosen hashkafa, which school they send their kids to, which seminary you went to, or how many years the husband spent learning kollel. Typically, while frum women face similar barriers to coming forward in those relationships, it's usually that much more difficult for frum women to reach out for help, which is why we need to be that much more sensitive and resourceful for frum survivors. Some kinds of ways that we see abuse manifesting, the most obvious tends to be the physical. That can be if your spouse is pushing you, throwing things at you or in general, blocking you from leaving, or even the threat of harm to you without actually raising a fist. There's verbal abuse, which can include many aspects, including name calling, put downs, or shouting. Emotional and psychological abuse can look like playing mind games, making you think you must be going crazy, saying that things that happened are all in your head, placing excessive blame on you, challenging all decisions, teaching children to disrespect the other partner. It can include very commonly financial abuse. Even a family that may look like they're quite well off may have a spouse that has absolutely no access to money, or that one partner is controlling all the bank accounts and giving their spouse an allowance like $50 to last an entire week to support a family with 8 children. Sexual abuse also occurs in our families, forcing or coercing unwanted intimacy. Why is it so important that we label unhealthy versus abuse? It is a sticky topic. Why can't we just say unhealthy and unhealthy? Unhealthy and maybe less healthy. The reason that it's important has to do with how we offer help to those people seeking it. It's important to emphasize that when a relationship is truly abusive and not just showing signs of dysfunction and miscommunication, there's often a serious concern for the safety of one of the partners. In an abusive relationship where there's a pattern of power and control of one partner over another, and one partner is not taking responsibility for the harm they are causing, then the abuse and possibly violence tends to escalate over time. In this case, we must realize that it's not a shalom bias concern, but that one partner's safety and possibly the safety of their children may be seriously at risk. Avital?
Yeah, and I realize I just want to take a moment to point out, because we've been speaking a lot from the perspective of the woman and life, and of course, abuse affects men as well. Statistically, women are more often the victims of an abusive dynamic, but we certainly treat and we certainly support many victims, many survivors who are men. At Shalom Task Force, we receive many calls to our hotline from the men who are the victims in the relationship. So of course, it's important just for us to point that out as well. And so, yeah, as you're kind of giving a framework for being able to recognize the definition for domestic abuse and the different forms of abuse and understanding that it's a pattern, I just want to take a moment to point out for us to be aware of some of the red flags that may point to an abusive relationship. And these are the red flags that we really emphasize in our education awareness workshops, premarital workshops. These are red flags that just statistically often point to potentially some of the patterns of an abusive relationship. So what we look out for in dating, generally it's disrespect, somebody who has a real temper, controlling, somebody who's being dishonest, jealous, a lot of jealousy, not giving space. And of course, that doesn't mean that if one of those traits is coming up for somebody, it doesn't mean, let's say, for example, jealousy, it doesn't mean that there's never room for jealousy in a relationship. Of course, there can be that. And that doesn't mean that it's an abusive dynamic. But we look out for these different dynamics that are coming up. And if we're noticing that these are playing out, and that there's a pattern there, this is something we definitely want to look at more carefully. Especially when we're talking about the dating stage, we always want to make sure to ask questions. We always want to look into something further. We never want to just gloss over something and ignore red flags. I'll share a story with you of somebody who calls our hotline. Of course, this is a composite of different stories and protecting the details and the anonymity of the person. But somebody called our hotline and described the escalation of years of abuse in her marriage. When she reflected on her dating process, in hindsight, the red flags were there. She described the edginess in his mood on a date when people dining at the next table were noisy. He was tense for the rest of the evening. He apologized to her the next morning, and then she found herself trying to avoid any situations that would put him in a bad mood. In marriage, this escalated into him shouting at her and losing it when their own baby was crying, similar to that situation of being so unnerved when the diners at the next table were making noise, holding her responsible for not being a good mother or for causing him stress. In retrospect, she connected all the dots of the patterns of those behaviors that were already playing out during their dating. And typically, when we receive calls to our hotline, or if anybody is reflecting back on their dating stage, typically the red flags were there. And that in a lot of ways is an empowering message, because that lets us know that if we can really raise awareness and bring attention to some of these red flags, people have a better chance of getting early intervention with this early detection. So at the time, this woman lacked the awareness of the red flags and the language for how to even describe what she was feeling. And this is really vital awareness to have during dating. It is always helpful to address something that doesn't feel right and to seek help. Worst case scenario, you'll determine that it was a misunderstanding or miscommunication or just general nerves and feel reassured. But it's always better to check into this further with dating.
As we talked about earlier, there are some barriers to our children and members of the community reaching out for help, whether the relationship is truly abusive or even if there are just some concerns that are unique to our community. Interestingly, sometimes those barriers actually come from very positive values that we teach our children, which we as their parents have a pretty unique influence in transmitting in a balanced and healthy way. So for example, one of the values that's often emphasized is the value of being mevater, putting somebody else first and putting our ego aside, which in many ways is a beautiful message. A similar message is taught to women and often misinterpreted by men who wish to use it as a tool for control. Isha kashera osa retzon bala. A kosher woman is one who complies with her husband's will. When that value is misinterpreted, it can look like, I know he always insists that we do things his way. I know he doesn't often know how to speak nicely to me, but shouldn't I not care about that? Should I not care about what I want? Shouldn't I be mevater? Just like with all midos, which literally mean measurements, we have the power to address this barrier by teaching a balance. We can encourage our children to let their friend go first, but that shouldn't turn into your child always going last. Our values can be properly ingrained when we are mindful of balancing our messages of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha and chesed, and ensuring that we're spending as much time talking about respectful relationship towards ourselves, towards themselves, as we are talking about relationships with others. Another particularly noticeable barrier in our community is that one we used to call shanda, but I don't actually know anyone who uses that word, or shame or embarrassment in front of family and the community, that there may be something wrong with them or their family if there's some sort of lack of shalom bias in their home. We're taught, girls in particular, but both genders, about the all-important role in maintaining the shalom bias. If they're experiencing distress in their relationship, they fear their community, their parents, their family in general will be ashamed of and by them. And that fear of shame is real, to the extent that even admitting to oneself that something's really wrong in the relationship can carry a lot of shame. But we have the power as family, parents, community, that the education of our children needs to include, no matter what happens, that we will support you and not be embarrassed of your needs for help. If our daughter came home from high school and told us about a fight she had with her friend, perhaps because that friend was disrespecting her, of course we wouldn't tell her how ashamed we are of her for experiencing conflict in her relationship, because we recognize conflict as present in all relationships, and we make space for that reality. We don't want to send these messages to our children or anyone when they're experiencing conflict in their marriage, that there's something wrong with them for getting help. We want to create a space for people to come forward and to be supported. Shalom bias is important, but even more importantly, Chazal teach us, Gadol kavod habrios shedocha lo sasa b'Torah. The dignity of a person is so great that may at times override a biblical commandment. When we are able to offer our support, our ear, and our heart to a child or a friend reaching out for help in their relationship, we're reinforcing those values of dignity and safety that we as parents have been teaching them from childhood. Dina, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, I think that it's really those things are sometimes barriers for people, like you're saying, the shame, or they're scared if I get help, it will be embarrassing. I've heard some women also say that sometimes what stops them from getting help is they assume that, well, if I'm going to go to a marriage therapist and she's just going to call abuse and say, get divorced. And sometimes women, really are scared of hearing that or going that route. And it's a little bit of a scary thought to them to be that honest with themselves if they think that relaying that to someone in a therapy session might end them to be in a space where they never really, I guess, put themselves in that box. You know, they maybe never thought of themselves as abused, and sometimes they're scared, well, if I go to a therapist, she'll tell me like how terrible my relationship is, and just to get divorced. How can you address that concern a little bit?
Yeah, we actually get phone calls with that prelude all the time. And again, domestic violence services at JFSA primarily provides advocacy, not necessarily therapy. And we're there as helpers in many different ways in case management. So often someone will call with exactly those concerns that you're describing. And fortunately and unfortunately, JFSA Domestic Violence Services helps many individuals across the spectrum from the frum community with those values of marriage who are afraid that they're just going to be told, you know, this is abusive, you should get divorced. Or sometimes we've had clients say, I think maybe my rabbi might be nervous about me calling because, you know, he doesn't want us to get divorced. And we definitely want to make that message clear that that is not our role. Just to give a story as an example, and obviously it's a conglomerate of many different stories to protect the confidentiality of our clients. We recently had a frum woman call to speak with an advocate, and she started off saying, I don't really know why I'm calling because my husband is the kindest, most respected man I know. I don't know how you can help me. I don't want you to tell me what to do. So immediately we assured her confidentiality. And then we get to the meat of what prompted her to make that phone call. And she started describing that she felt scared because even though her husband was nice to everybody else and he hadn't actually hit her in over a year, she felt that she was constantly walking on eggshells. They had been to many rabbanim, they had tried therapy. Ultimately, nobody was really encouraging them to work this out anymore, but she wasn't sure what to do. She did feel scared, and she learned to tiptoe around him. And once the stress got too much for her to bear, and she saw that it was taking a toll on the children, she realized she needed to make this phone call. Our advocate assessed her situation for safety, which did seem to be of concern, but never labeled it as abusive. We never say you're in an abusive relationship or you've got to get out of there. Instead, the advocate said, as we always do, tell me what you want. Unless the client comes to the conclusion on his or her own, our job is never to label the relationship as abusive, never to encourage divorce. When this woman admitted eventually that she felt she had no choice but to leave, but she was also scared to, our advocate was there to help her with safety planning, as the risk of violence is significantly worse when one tries to leave. The client was touched when the advocate, who isn't even Jewish, suggested, along with other safety measures, to also leave a skirt and a tichel on hand or in the car in case she felt unsafe and needed to get out and didn't want the hesitation of making sure that she was modest before. Because all our advocates are educated about the frum community and its concerns. We were able to help this woman by consulting with her various rabbanim. We helped connect her to free legal assistance at that particular time from Ohio Domestic Violence Network, and connected her to a supportive therapist. Later, actually, when she was in need of food assistance, she totally despaired of getting help from some of our wonderful community resources like the Chesed Center, because on paper, her husband was bringing in a respectable salary and she wouldn't be eligible, even though in practice, he barely gave her enough for herself and the kids to live on. So with her permission, we coordinated with the Chesed Center to explain confidentially her situation, and were able to give her and her family the help that they needed. We also get plenty of clients who realize on their own after discussion and education that they're in relationships that are worth it, and that are challenging but not abusive, and that ultimately we're worth trying to save through therapy and other means. Ultimately, our mission is to empower and respect our clients' autonomy over their own life. Avital?
Yeah, you know, I'm so happy you're really emphasizing the attitude and the approach that you take, and of course, you know, really any professionals who are looking, any mental health professionals, but of course, specifically anybody who's looking to support someone through an abusive situation. The approach, of course, is so much about empowerment, because as we said, you know, somebody who has had in so many different ways is having the power and the control and their self, their agency and their dignity stripped away from them. Of course, the last thing we want to do is be another controlling force in their life. Of course, we want to only approach individuals with this kind of empowerment. And I think so similarly, what I was saying earlier about this mother, you know, early on from Muncie, who was reaching out to help her daughter and trying to help her figure it out. Parents, neighbors, friends, loved ones, anybody who's really looking to support someone in an abusive relationship, it can feel sometimes very counterintuitive to really not say, oh my gosh, just get out, or this is crazy, or don't stand for this, or, you know, any responses like that that are just so natural, and there's so much born from this need to want to protect the person who we care for. But of course, we find that when support is able to be delivered with empowerment at the core, empowerment of the other person, you tell me how I can best help you. You know your situation best. I want to be here for you. Of course, that's really how we see the best response and the best ability to really help somebody correctly and appropriately. So I think just to wrap up, I wanted to share a powerful lesson about parental modeling that we learned from Yosef Hatzadik, the story about Yosef. The source in Bracious, we learn about Yosef being tempted. He's in the house of Potiphar. He's working for him, and he's tempted by Eshes Potiphar, the wife, who basically propositions him, and he doesn't yield to temptation. So where did Yosef get that strength to resist? After all, he was alone. He was abandoned by his family. He was working as a slave in a foreign, unfamiliar land. Circumstances that could surely lead someone to fail, to lose their sense of values, and to behave poorly. And we would totally understand that. And yet we learn from Gemara Sotza, Diukno Shel Aviv, the image of his father. It was at that moment that Yosef saw the image of his father. He heard his voice echoing in his ears, teaching him right from wrong and reminding him of who he could be. And at a time when a child is already out of their parents' home, I think what we learned from this is really that when potentially a child is already out of a parent's home or experiencing a hardship, a challenge in their life, that child may conjure up the image of their parents, the modeling that took place. And this is what may define their behavior and the next steps in a situation, how they respond. So we want to model healthy relationships for our children. We want the impression that they draw up in their minds when they think of us to be an image that fuels them and strengthens them to make good choices, to live their lives and relationships with strong values. And I think we'll wrap up with any other questions. I think, okay, so we have all the information in the chat with our phone numbers. Yeah, so somebody asked if I could repeat the hotline text line info or post on the group. So the phone
Avital
number,
just posted it on the chat.
okay, yeah. And the number is, it's 888-883-2323. It's confidential, anonymous. And generally people sometimes want to know what kind of calls we get. Sometimes individuals call in just for support. That's all they want then. We sometimes take calls where somebody just wants to cry, and this is the only resource, the only anonymous, safe space for them to be able to call and just to cry and to talk about what's going on. We provide resources that are based on what it is that the person is asking for, whether it's a therapist. We connect individuals to sometimes different trained leaders in the community who could be helpful. Again, we get calls often now because we do so much premarital education and dating awareness education. We get a lot of calls about dating. A lot of calls, is this normal? Does this make sense? Is this a red flag? I took a workshop a couple of years ago and I remembered something that the presenter said, and here I am dating now and I'm just not sure if this is healthy or not. So we get a lot of calls with questions. I'm really, Yael, I'm so happy to be able to really now be in a community that has a shelter, that the JFSA shelter, the Hebrew shelter home that is available for victims of domestic abuse with the services and the sensitivity to be able to be a suitable environment for a frum victim, because this is something that so many communities unfortunately do not have, and often is the barrier to a frum victim being able to be in a safe place. So again, just drawing attention to the shelter, which is an incredible resource that our community has. I see, are there a couple more questions that came in?
I do think so. Hold on.
Somebody asked if Shalom Task Force has workshops.
Yes, someone asking if Shalom Task Force has workshops.
Yeah, for engaged couples. So yeah, we have another department called Shalom Workshop. These are workshops that we offer for engaged and even married couples. We encourage everybody to reach out and request a workshop. These workshops are not abuse focused. We cover all of the really vital skills of having a healthy marriage, communication, conflict resolution. There's even a section about financial planning. Yeah, so we encourage people to reach out, and you can go to the website, you can call the Shalom Task Force and to request a workshop.
Avital, are those available in Cleveland, or those are just something that you would only be able to access if you're in New York?
So we have been providing for the past couple of years. There are several different communities that have reached out for workshops that are given in a community forum. So for example, the Detroit community flew in a couple of Shalom workshop presenters, and they had like a 2.5-hour program at a shul there. There were about 35 couples that attended. And the way that the workshop was set up is that each couple was working discreetly with their spouse. It wasn't like everybody was working together, but the presenters, the facilitators, were able to cover the content and to provide a lot of practical tools for couples to be able to then, take home and continue to work on. So yeah, we offer these programs throughout the U.S.
Avital, something I know we wanted to mention at the end is that we really appreciate so many members of the community coming out to support this. And this is just the start of a collaboration of JFSA and Shalom Task Force, continuing the conversation with the community for classes and programs that you and the community want, both for yourselves, for your children, for your children's school. And we encourage you to reach out to Shalom Task Force, to reach out to JFSA, and ask for the kinds of programs and the kinds of classes that you want, that we're happy to partner with you. We've been really proud partners of Shalom Task Force for many, many years. And many of our referrals from the community come from Shalom Task Force and vice versa. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Shoshana, did you want to wrap us up?
Yes. Thank you, ladies, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Shalom Task Force, Naaleh, and JFSA for making this event available for all the women in our community this evening. We look forward to a continued partnership in strengthening our community together. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you.